influenza used to be the old person's friend, but it's actually making Ian very young. And so keep up the good work, Ian.
Not sure about young Lou, but thanks for inviting me along again this year. For those of you wondering why influenza gets the first cab off the rank every time at this meeting, it's because I complain a lot if it doesn't get the first bill. But it used to be the influenza specialist group many years ago, for those of you who are new to this meeting, and that transformed into the immunisation specialist group, and now it's immunisation coalition. But I think influenza is still an important part of our agenda and remit. So I'm going to give you a bit of a refresh. This is my title rather than the title which was given to me. I forgot about that. And we're going to retrace 2024, and hopefully we can learn a few lessons moving forward into 2025 about influenza in Australia. So I always ask this question because there's always a diverse set of opinions here. All right, let's go. Normal season last year, 2024. It's not that long ago. Nobody wants to vote for normal season. How about a low season? Peter, you should put your hand up here. Western Australia got off lightly. Medium season. Oh, Kim thinks it's a medium season. Big season. Massive season. We've got one massive and little or no. Right, so it's somewhere between a big and massive, I think, depending how you gauge it. So I've got my one summary slide here, so you can go to sleep after this. Did you know that we had a record number of NNDSS, this is laboratory confirmed cases of influenza in 2024, 365,000. I always ask people, what's the real number? Do you multiply by 10, by 5, by 100? Nobody can give me a straight answer. So if anybody's got any ideas how to get a real number out of the NNDSS, laboratory confirmed cases, let me know. But probably 10 is the number I always use. So it was a bit of a strange season again compared to some of the previous season. So overall, and I'll show you some of the nuances of that later, but overall the season started in April and peaked in early June, tailed off in October. The number of cases, which I'll show you in a few slides' time, in January is actually quite high, so that's an interesting little tidbit. So we had quite a few admissions into the hospital, both children, median age of 4, and adults, median age of 63. And there's always a certain proportion of those, this is not an outrageous number, 6.4% admitted directly into ICU. 7 children in the age range of 0 to 9 died from influenza-related deaths. These are NNDSS numbers, so this is again an underestimate. And over all the age groups, there were 500 influenza-related deaths, again according to the NNDSS, and not surprisingly, the median age is in the elderly group 74 years old. And much to our chagrin, only 32% of Australians approximately were vaccinated against influenza in 2024, something we should not be very proud of. So, various methods for tracking influenza. So here's some of the data taken from the Australian Respiratory Surveillance Report, which is a fantastic document. So if you're not getting this, you should get this and have a look at this every fortnight when it comes out. Aspirin is the GP system there, and you can see in green is the 2024, so they would say pretty typical year. Flu tracking, always hard to interpret in my opinion. 2024 again in green, looking like a typical year according to their analysis. What I like best is the NNDSS, it's black and white, influenza or not, and shown in this blue colour for a change is the 2024 season. And you can see the area under the curve means that it was a big year. And if you compare it to some of the other years, 2022 was an earlier season, and you can see there that that was also a fairly short and sharp season. And 2023, shown in that dark red colour there, had a lower peak, but it had broad range there and had cases right through the year, even into spring and summer. So what's a season? CDC defined a season starting and ending when their influenza rates are 3% of tests positive for influenza. We don't have any particular definition of a season, so I just drew a few lines on here, and my estimate is something like 22 weeks. So a pretty long season. Everybody thinks that influenza's over in a month or two, but in fact, you know, it actually can go for 4 or 5 or even 6 months with increased cases. Just to remind you, and I'll show you some nuances of this data. So this is Australian-wide data, and not everything is contained in the summaries. I'll show you the states data in a minute. And you'll see that these peaks do vary from state to state. But overall, the usual peak, what we saw pre-COVID was the peak of influenza usually occurring in early August. You could almost bet on it the first or second week of August. And now we're back at week 27 overall. And I mentioned January, so January is usually a quiet time for influenza. So the NNDSS has recorded some nearly 14,000 cases of influenza, so I think Australians are travelling more than ever and bringing home some little souvenirs from the Northern Hemisphere. So it will be interesting to see whether that line stays above the average there or whether it tails off when the money runs out. So I mentioned the nuances of these epidemic curves, and you can see here that there is quite a bit of difference here. So Northern Territory, not surprisingly, a tropical environment there, that they have these different seasonality of influenza, often associated with the wet season, but also usually a small peak when we have our main peaks in winter. You can see there that New South Wales, especially, and Victoria had this little peak at week 27, and then the rest of the country did their own thing around week 32. So when we're thinking about rolling out vaccine programs, there are these subtleties which need to be investigated and checked out as we go through. But, you know, overall, these things are very hard to predict in future. So in general, and it's very much in general, influenza is arriving earlier and the epidemics are earlier than pre-pandemic in most states. The age distribution for the NNDSS data, it's always skewed towards the younger children, no different this time around. So what about influenza types and subtypes? For those of you who are in the know, we know we have influenza A, two different types, H3 and H1, and for influenza B, we used to have two lineages, B. vic and B. yamagata. B. yamagata is now gone, haven't seen anything since March 2020. So you can see in 2024, most states had a combination of H3N2 and H1 pandemic circulating in 2024. H1 was certainly early on the dominant virus circulating, and then that was taken over later in the season by H3N2. Here you can see there is some variation between states there. For example, WA is showing a much higher proportion of H3N2 compared to, say, Tasmania. So FluCan records hospital admissions with respiratory diseases. They're now doing 3. They're doing COVID, influenza and RSV. And you can see there the numbers of influenza are pretty impressive, and COVID bumps along all through the year. The good news is that the FluCan will be now operating year-round for influenza and for RSV rather than just from April till October. And you can see there that influenza is probably similar numbers to COVID overall and higher than RSV. The y-axes have different values on there, so it makes it a little bit hard to interpret. So this is just a little quick summary here to see how we're going from year to year. So 2023, we had nearly 300,000, so we're above that. We had more deaths in 2024. And again, these are NNDSS numbers, which are an underestimate. But just to give you an idea, the NNDSS numbers for COVID were 2,200 odd, and for RSV were 170 in 2024. So influenza is between those two. And just looking at other respiratory viruses, some of these get a bit of a run every now in the media. So adenovirus, enteroviruses, human metapneumovirus had a big run in the Chinese media, saying that it was out of control. That wasn't true. It was only a minor proportion of the cases seen there, about 6%. You can see there, this is New South Wales data showing a bump in human metapneumovirus towards the end of the year. But again, these numbers are quite small for some of these other viruses. Rhinoviruses are always in the mix. On the right-hand side, COVID and influenza and RSV. So you can see all the sort of numbers there. And the highest numbers of cases in these particular graphs in New South Wales were influenza. So I just want to touch on the AIR database and the vaccination data. Now, I know the AIR database has its limitations and people disparage it at some stages and praise it in others. But using their data, which is the best data available, I just put up some of these figures for you to contemplate. So in 2021, we had 34% of the population vaccinated. We then had a bit of a run in 2022 where we got up to 43%, but now we're back in the doldrums. And from 2023 to 2024, we dropped some 500,000 doses from what we did the previous year, a reduction of about 5% of total doses. So I just want to again drill down a little bit on states. I think you need to look at the individual states and how they're performing. So ACT, who's from the ACT here? All right, Gary, you're doing a great job. So you can see there they've got the highest rates, especially the group which we're interested in trying to protect, the 6 months to less than 5 years. 47% is a fantastic effort. So whatever they're doing, we need to learn from that, and the other states need to pick up their act. One thing they used to do was send out a lot of notices to people, reminding them of vaccination time. I don't know whether they still do that, but whatever they're doing a good job. You can see all age groups, they're higher apart from the over 65s. And good old Tassie's just pipped them at the post. So well done, Tassie. Who's here from Tassie? Woo! So that's all Australians. So this is taken off the NCRS database. And if we look at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander performance, it's not quite as straightforward. So ACT is still doing well in terms of the 6 months to less than 5, but Northern Territory comes up for the silver and Tassie for the bronze, or maybe equal silver, with good efforts in the older adults and elderly. So I think, this is something we can learn from, and maybe some of the states can exchange ideas while you're here. Just ask Gary and he'll have all the answers. So moving forward, free vaccination is one of my core celebs. I think it always starts, if the government thinks it's worthwhile and the government's paying for it, it must be important. That's one of the dogmas I have, or many people do have. But going forward, so in 2024 there was only Western Australia and Queensland who had free vaccinations, and 2025, same too. So well done, Western Australia. Who's here from Western Australia? Peter, yeah, well done, Peter. Queensland, woohoo! However, it didn't really help. I don't know what's going on in WA. So Peter is solely responsible for this drop of 15%. So I thought, that's a very big drop, 15% in 1 year. And so I thought, well, let's have a look at Queensland. So they had a minor drop of 4.5% and was similar to New South Wales, who didn't do anything. So they had a drop of 4.9. So, I'm not sure how we learn from these sort of things, but clearly whatever you're doing in WA is not working, Peter, so it's up to you for 2025, no pressure. So this is one thing, you just got to have a celebrity die. So I don't know who Barbara Hugh is, but does anybody know who Barbara Hugh is? She's some mega star in something called Meteor Garden, apparently. Very well followed in Asia, especially Singapore. So 2,000 extra people signed up for vaccination after Barbara, who was only 48-year-old, died from influenza. So for those of you who read the product inserts, this is what you're going to find in your vaccines this year. So we have one change, the H3N2 component has been updated to Croatia-like virus, and we have a quadrivalent vaccine in Australia and New Zealand this year. We are endeavouring to remove the B Yamagata component, so the B Phuket is still there this year, but hopefully it'll be gone next year. So what's new? Very little, nothing's really changed in the influenza vaccines for 2025. It's the same old, same old. There is one interesting thing that, anybody here from AstraZeneca? Right? She's promised, personally, to have that vaccine available for 2 to 49, is that right? Right, she can't say anything, but it's something like that. 2 to 49-year-olds. And an interesting twist on this is in the US, you can now take home your little nasal spray and administer it yourself. So it's obviously very simple to use. And I think it's got some definite benefit in the younger children, as has been shown in the UK. So looking forward to that in 2026. So I can actually modify this slide. I haven't changed in about 4 years. So just a quick mention, what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere. They're seeing a similar season, maybe a little bit less than 2024, but we'll see how it pans out. Things are still happening, as I'll show you. So this is the sort of virus which is circulating. So in most of Europe, it's mainly H1. Africa is mainly B, South America mainly B, and North America mainly H3 with some H1 and very little B. So the US data is quite variable. So you can see there's a heat map there for influenza activity. And I took this off the website yesterday, so it's pretty much up to date, February the 1st data set. And you can see the purple is intense influenza-like activity, so places like Texas are seeing very high levels, and some of the East Coast states are also seeing high levels, and some of the other states are quite low, so quite variable. You can see at the bottom there that they're seeing a mixture of H3 and H1 viruses in the red and the orange. And you can see this funny curve, this epicurve here in the top right-hand side there, where they've had this sort of second bump after Christmas. I'm sure Trump organised this as well. And they've seen an increase, not only in the stock exchange, but also an increase in the cases of influenza. And the bottom curve there is deaths in children under 18. And you can see it looks like it could be milder than the previous year, but it's still early days. So this is another way of looking at mortality. So this is something they've concocted in the last few years to compare. And this is straight for influenza, and this is for all ages. So again, similar, but maybe less so than 2024, and more similar to 2022, 2023. So in the UK, so they've been and done that. So it looks like their season's on the downward slope there. You can see in the dark blue there. And in the right-hand side there, the type of influenza they've seen has been mainly H1 with a smattering of H3s and a little bit of B, and that's on the rise, so that may increase. So it would be important for me to just touch on avian influenza and zoonotic, considering it's getting a lot of press and may one day impact us here in Australia. So this is the number of outbreaks reported to the FAO on their website, and this is probably, again, a big underestimate for 2024. So this is up until early December. And you can see each dot on there is an outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza in different places. And you can see Europe, North America are riddled with these outbreaks over the years. South America, I think, have given up mainly reporting, but you can see there's cases right up and down South America and also into Antarctica and the subantarctic islands. And even in Hawaii, they've had outbreaks of this highly pathogenic. Most of the dots on here are due to the H5N1, which you've heard all about, but there are outbreaks in Southeast Asia which are not quite the same H5. And we've had our own outbreaks of H7, I should say, both in Australia and recently in New Zealand, as I'll show you. So just to give you up-to-date information on what's happening in the dairy cows have now been infected with avian influenza as of probably late 2023 and early 2024. And you can see there on the left-hand curve there, they've had a huge number of herds which have been infected. That's not individual cows, that's herds. So 959 confirmed cases in 18 states. Probably only California is doing good surveillance. So it's probably all over the states, one would imagine. So in terms of human infections, there's very few people being infected, amazingly enough. So 116,000 tests CDC say they've done, and they've only turned up 67 infected individuals. This again may be an underestimate, but let's just take it on face value. Most of those have been in California. Most of those have been associated with dairy herds, but a small number, a reasonable number, 23 of those cases associated with poultry farms where they're undergoing culling operations when the virus has been identified. So a very small number of human cases in amongst a huge number of poultry and dairy cows. So that's the good news. So we've had our first case of H5N1 here in Australia. So just got to mention on ProMed. So probably most of you have heard me talk about this, but for those who haven't, just briefly, the child returned from India, was unwell, hospitalised here in Melbourne. Influenza A was detected by PCR, but wasn't subtyped, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. The child was treated with oseltamivir regardless at a prolonged stay in intensive care and was very ill. Was also in ICU for 2 weeks. Child was discharged home, made a complete recovery. We got sent this sample as just an everyday sample in amongst all the other samples from Hospital X, and we just inadvertently or good selection actually sequenced this virus and found out it to be highly pathogenic H5N1. So in fact, it wasn't similar to these viruses I've been talking about that are occurring in the US. It was something which is more associated with viruses that have been circulating in poultry and wild birds in Southeast Asia, mainly around the subcontinent, India and Bangladesh. and the highest match was to a Bangladesh virus. All gene segments were still of avian, there hadn't been any mixing, and it was still a very avian-like virus. It hadn't acquired any of the mammalian traits that we might be concerned about. It was a reassortant virus, so quite a novel virus for all intents and purposes. So the other thing which happened last May and June of 2024 was these big poultry outbreaks in Victoria and New South Wales and the ACT, so it's got shared around. So these viruses are normally low pathogenic viruses. They're usually in water birds, such as ducks, and they can occasionally spill over into properties. And when it does, it has a devastating effect on these poultry flocks. Within 2 or 3 days, they'll kill every chicken in the coop. So here's just the properties which were affected. So we had H7N3 in Victoria, along with one outbreak of H7N9. We had the H7N8, same virus in both Sydney and Canberra. And all these happening within 2 months, a very unprecedented effect. And this is a slide that Michelle Willey from our group has put together. So there's just some of the outcomes from that. We had 2 million birds which are culled. Who's had trouble getting eggs at the supermarket? I was at a supermarket yesterday and there's still a sign up, 1 box per person. So it's still happening. So these are Australian viruses. These are not ones which have come in from international places. So these are things we've cooked up ourselves and still are circulating, as I'll show you in a minute. New Zealand also had its first outbreak. I actually landed on the same day when they announced this in New Zealand. And it was a farm in Otago. So there's a little dot down there, just south of Dunedin, and 220,000 free-range birds were culled due to this outbreak. And the more you buy free-range, really free-range birds, the more chance there is for these infections to go on and continue into the future. So this is just a phylogenetic tree of the hemagglutinin gene, and just shows you that all these viruses group into their own little areas. So the Australian have their own little group, New Zealand has its own little group, Europeans and North American have their own little groups, and the Chinese group, which had an outbreak back in 2013 to about 2018, which infected hundreds of humans, has also its own little group. So I turned on to Australia Today this morning, and we found there's another outbreak of bird flu in Victoria. So it's H7N8. I haven't seen a tree yet, so I don't know whether it's similar to other viruses we've seen in the past, but they say it's different again. And this is great timing by whoever said this, that on Thursday the federal government announced Australia was officially bird flu free. There have been no detections of H7 avian influenza since July. So I bet they want their time again. So I think, we've just got to expect these things to happen, and we need to be prepared for these sort of things and try and deal with them the best we can. So in summary, we had an early season, at least New South Wales did, in 2024, and we didn't have this continued low-level circulation in October and November and December that we saw in 2023. But the numbers in January 2025 are something to be a little bit wary and concerned about. Record numbers. We had H3 predominating in many states, but also H1 had a big run as well. Very little influenza B, which is interesting. Moderately high number of deaths. No BEMs being circulated, so that's good news. I haven't talked about antiviral resistance, but we've seen very little antiviral resistance to the licensed drugs, oseltamivir and zanamivir. Baloxavir marboxil is a very good antiviral drug. It's been registered here in Australia but not distributed. Maybe that will change in the future. VEs, the ones I've seen, most of them are interim, but they've been pretty good. Vaccination rates are pretty low. The H3 components change for 2025. Hopefully the BEM will get out in 2026 for our vaccines. Variable activity in the Northern Hemisphere. And my prediction for 2025, and I looked at my one last year, it was pretty accurate, so I'm on a bit of a run here. So a low to moderate year with H3 virus predominating, an increased circulation of B. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm actually on time. It's a miracle.
Ian's ahead of time. We do have time for questions. There is an online one first, Ian. Why are people in America getting bird flu not very sick, whereas the ones in China appear to be very sick?
Well, the ones in China have been sick, so that's a slightly different virus. So the ones which have been festering for more than 10 years now is a H5N6 virus, so it is slightly different from the H5N1 virus. There is a lot of virus around here, so in these milking sheds, these cows can have very high levels of virus in their udders and in the milk. So it's not a matter of not having enough virus. So the main rationale would be that the virus hasn't adapted enough to humans to actually truly infect them. There has been one death in the US in recent times, but that was not from the cows, that was from the birds. So it's adaptation is the main reason, I think. If you injected this virus into a human, you'd probably have a pretty fatal outcome, but I think it's mainly adaptation. So getting in, replicating to a high enough level.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
Thanks, Ian, for your review. One comment and one question. The comment is, looking at the figures that you put up for vaccination rates in the over 65, going back about almost 2 decades, I think we achieved a level of something like 92% in the over 65s. We're now under 70%, and I think that's really something to take on board. I'm not suggesting any way of approaching that. But looking at the figures for Australia and for the USA, the projected figures for the USA for this coming season, it seems that we've had 3 seasons in succession of exceptionally high levels of influenza. Now, is this just a legacy of the COVID period, or is it something else going on?
Yeah, well, H3 has been around for 2 of those 3 years in large numbers, and wherever there's H3, as you well know, the numbers are usually up. I suspect that there is a bit of a legacy, a bit of a carryover, or maybe the herd immunity is not quite as high by not seeing viruses every year. But it is unusual to have these big seasons one after the other. It's usually every second or every third year, so it is unusual. People always tell me, well, it's just more testing and more testing, but I don't think there's radically more testing in the last couple of years, so I don't think that's the answer. And in fact, many of the public hospitals are doing less testing in 2024 and going forward than they have in the past, so I'm not sure that's the answer. But clearly, these viruses are moving around and infecting reasonably large numbers. The kids are going to be susceptible every year. No vaccine. Haven't seen the virus. As you know, the attack rates are only sort of 5 to 10, 15% maximum. So there's lots of susceptibles out there, even if we do have a big season.
Alan Chin.
Just wondering if you want to comment on the implications of the withdrawal of the WHO, the US from the WHO, and in particular the implications for like the Nagoya Protocol and virus sharing and so on.
I think I'll stop Nagoya because that's just government prattle, so that will go on regardless. The Trumpism will have a huge effect on WHO. They're the major funder, and especially in the influenza field. For those of you who don't know, the Global Influenza Surveillance Response System is heavily funded by WHO. But even the polio program, for example, all their test kits come out of the IRR, which is funded by CDC. So it's not just influenza, it's going to be everything that CDC covers. And, we can't even contact CDC at the moment. They don't answer emails, don't answer the phone. It's a shocking affair.
Lance?
Good thing we've got you here, Ian.
Oh, okay.
Coming back to H7 and bird flu and these clusters of infections that are occurring over the past year, both in Australia and New Zealand, would you like to speculate on any reasons why we're starting to see this? Is there any data on changes in the environment or changes in the population of animals?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. Why are we seeing these spillovers into farms now. Clearly these viruses have been circulating for a number of years. If you had a close look at that tree, those H7 viruses have been around since the early 2010s. So, it's not that the virus hasn't been there. Maybe there might be an increased amount of it. We have pretty limited surveillance in the wildlife, but, people like Michelle do quite a bit of surveying in Victoria at least, and we know that H7's there. We know H5 is there, even probably sometimes more than the H7, but that hasn't spilled over into the flocks yet. So I think the free range is a big issue. So the more free range, the more chance for interaction with wild birds and infected fecal matter and all that sort of thing. So, I think it's always been there. These farms are quite intensive, and they're all localised in the same area, and they're usually in the areas where there's plentiful water supply, natural attraction for wild birds. So it's just something simmering, waiting for spillover. Why it's happening more, let's wait and see whether this was an exceptional year or not in 2024. I suspect it was. We haven't seen anything since 2020. So 2020 we saw a similar sort of problem, outbreaks in the same places. It's 4 years later till we saw the next one. So it's not happening every day, every year.
And a couple of quick ones online. Can a GP request subtyping if they do in the lab? Yes or no?
Sure.
Good. And the second question is from Rachel at Ausdoc. With the sort of change in pattern post-COVID, the earlier seasons, do you think we'll get back to the good old days of flu season starting in May and finishing on the 1st of September?
Yeah, look, I think we've got to be just wary of these sorts of things. There's obviously an interplay, viral interactions between all the big players, COVID now, and influenza and RSV. So, I don't think it's as simple as just looking at the calendar or looking at the weather map and deciding when the temperature is going to go below 10 degrees on the East Coast. I think, there are a lot of things in play now. COVID is a big player in this area. And just to go back to the subtyping thing, I think the most important one to be aware of is people working in ICU that get a return traveller from an endemic area. Subtyping should be mandatory for those people that end up in ICU with influenza from an unknown sort of situation. So that's a take-home message from our little H5 episode.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. Yes, please.
Hi, Ian. Just picking up on the point earlier about the differences between China, say, and America in terms of avian cases. I wonder whether any of that actually also has to do with human behaviour. Remembering back to the early days of the avian pandemic, the avian cases in China, in Indonesia and other parts, and these are backyard farms. This is very close contact with their poultry. It was around the cockfighting, lots of different behaviours here, and possibly then obviously standards in occupational health and safety, how they, keep the animals, the distance between animals and so forth. So I suppose it's just being conscious of the different elements between countries as well and how that's influencing
trends. But, if you've ever been into a dairy, there's milk going everywhere. There's
I think more
aerosols.
the chickens, but yeah.
Well, the chickens are a bit the same. The chickens going everywhere. So there's a lot of exposure there. And a lot of the US in these areas are itinerant workers. So unless they're really sick, they're not going anywhere. So good luck trying to get accurate numbers on those. And in China, we all sneer a bit about the Chinese system, but their acute and untyped or undiagnosed pneumonia cases is a very good system, and so they will pick up these cases when they do occur.
Ian, final question from Rod.
Thanks, Ian. If we get rid of the fourth vaccine or the B in our vaccines, are we going to have better vaccines? Is it going to make a difference, or you recommend we do something else with our spare spot?
Well, Sanofi are actually funding us, and we're in the middle of a trial adding an extra H3 or adding more H3 to the standard vaccine. So maybe I can give you outcomes of that serosurveillance next year. But there is an opportunity there to play around with the seasonal vaccine to try and improve it. And our philosophy is the H3 is the one that needs improving, and we'll try anything to improve that, apart from mRNA. Who said that?
Ian, thank you. Fabulous.